Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland. Here I am at Ham in London, and this is Pond House behind me. So I'm here to talk about Anthony Blunt, who lived here with his mother briefly in the 1930s. It's the only address of his that I've traced thus far. So Anthony Blunt is notorious for being a world-class traitor. So he was born in 1907 in Bournemouth, United Kingdom, and his father was an Anglican clergyman, and I think his grandfather was before. So they came from quite an upper class family actually, despite being clergy, but that was considered a very honourable occupation. And indeed he was distantly related to the Queen Mother. I think it was her third cousin, the Queen Mother, as in the mother of the current Queen, Elizabeth II. So Anthony Blunt was the third of three sons, if I've got that right, and his father was fairly well regarded even within the Anglican clergy, because they were highly esteemed even though they didn't have that much money. So the salary of Anglican clergy varied enormously according to the parish. Now, even the poorest Anglican clergyman would have been middle class, but the middle class obviously quite broad, and some of them would be on the fringes of the aristocracy. And then he got a plum job, Blunt's father. He was chaplain to the British Embassy in Paris. So Blunt spent some of his early childhood there, where he acquired absolute mastery in French. So he was a willowy boy, artistic in temperament, humane, perhaps a little bit diffident. So he was very fond of his books and very fast at them. He then attended Marlborough College, which is in Wiltshire. So Marlborough College, the town of Wiltshire, is not named after the Duke of Marlborough, as in Churchill's ancestor, and it was founded in the mid-19th century as a school for the sons of Anglican clergy. It's still thriving today, although very few children of Anglican clergy go there these days. It's mixed these days. I think right from its inception, you didn't have to be the son of a Church of England cleric to attend, but initially the majority of them were. So he went there, and he didn't like it in many ways because there was a heavy emphasis on team sports, and he was, well, a bit weedy as some people saw it. He was very brainy, which didn't help his case with some of the thugs there. But he did make some dear friends, notably Louis MacNeice. And Louis MacNeice was the son of a Church of Ireland clergyman from County Antrim. The Church of Ireland being a carbon copy of the Church of England, to such an extent that the 39 Articles of the Church of England, one of its founding documents, was simply taken by the Church of Ireland, and for England they would read Ireland. So MacNeice said that his family inherited the most terrible social twilight, because sectarian asperities being such as they were in the early 20th century, they couldn't socialise with Catholics, they couldn't speak to the working class because that would be in for a dig, and some of them thought to be uncouth and vulgar. They couldn't speak to the aristocracy because some of them thought to be fast, which meant they would have a whiskey on Saturday night. And so there were these cloying middle-class social climate types whom they could socialise with, who were all incredibly tedious and striving for respectability. So he was a bit of a free spirit, like Blunt, who went there. So it was at school that Blunt got into homosexuality. Now, for some people, this is a phase. They quickly moved out of it when they left school, when they met the opposite sex. But no, for Blunt, this was to be his bent his entire life, being bent, as we might have once said. So Blunt, he then went up to Trinity College, Cambridge, which was the grandest of colleges in Cambridge to this day. Has got the most undergraduates. It's an absolute magnificent building right in the heart of the city, by the Backs, by the River Cam. I think he was reading mathematics initially, but then he changed to French. So he had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of French literature. Of course, it was a bit of a cheat because he knew fluent French from his childhood in Paris. He'd become disillusioned with the establishment. Remember, he'd been a small boy in the First World War. Known teenagers who were a bit older than himself going off to get killed, some of them coming back maimed for life. He'd seen things like the General Strike and the Great Depression. Of course, he was an undergraduate at the time of when the Wall Street crash occurred, and he felt this was grossly unjust. So he got a double first, and he stayed on to be a Don. In those days, there was no need to have a higher degree. Just a primary degree was enough to be an academic, because very, very few people did further degrees. Remember that we're talking about the 1920s when he went to university, and back then about 2% of the UK population were gone to university. The schooling leaving age was 14. Most people left at 14, and that was it. Of course, you could go into school all the way to 18, but often because of financial constraints, people had to leave early. Well, obviously, Blunt was not so pecuniarily pressured to end his education prematurely. So he did very well there. He joined the Cambridge Apostles, which is a society based at Trinity. I don't think you have to be a Trinitarian to go there, as in it's some people call it a secret society. Perhaps that's not true. I mean, someone who's an apostle can tell you that he or she is an apostle, but the thing is, let's say it doesn't seek publicity. Put it this way, it's got no website. I've been going since the early 19th century. Alfred Lord Tennyson was a member, and they have these weekly discussions, and there are meant to be a dozen of them. They think the finest undergraduates of the time, and people who are members of the apostles who've graduated, have left, come back regularly. They're known as angels, and they have whales, which are, isn't it, some tuna sandwiches or something. But anyway, and it's a really discussion group. And their discursive sessions touch all manner of contentious topics, and people are told to speak their mind with absolute candour, and none of it will go outside this room, and just don't hold back. And so they began broaching topics which were really seen as off limits in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Things like racial equality, that homosexuality was entirely moral, things like that communism was right, that eugenics was right, that abortion ought to be permitted, there was nothing bad with pornography or whatever it was, or openly racist views. Any opinion, no matter how contentious, would be listened to with respect, and in that same tone could be strenuously disagreed with. And so he was in that society, but by the 1920s, it was a very left-wing society, although I don't think they actually banned right-wingers. Remember, it's tiny, 12 undergraduates at any one time, and there might be an equal number of angels who've come back for any one session. So he was attracted towards communism, and he then began working as an agent for the NKVD, as in Narodny Commissariat Vnutrych Dел, as in the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. That was a Soviet secret police recruited by Andrei Deutsch, who was really Czech, I believe. I think it was Czech Jewish, but had spent his adulthood in Vienna before moving to the United Kingdom, who recruited so many of these Cantabrigian spies. Now Blunt, he had a number of boyfriends. He attempted to seduce Louis MacNeice, the famous poet, and he said MacNeice was irredeemably heterosexual. Who else was at school with him? I'm just trying to think. It wasn't C.S. Lewis, who was a bit older than him. I think he didn't overlap with at Marlborough. And then the other one is John Betjeman was also at Marlborough, but again would have overlapped with him because he's born 1906, if I got that right, just the year ahead of him. So there he'd been a don for some time, and homosexual acts between people of all ages were illegal. However, it was quietly tolerated in intellectual and theatrical circles, so he never got arrested. But people like him, being gay, felt they were oppressed, no matter how privileged they were. And obviously, to some extent, that's true, because if they were caught having a completely consensual encounter with another man, that was jail time. Usually only a few months, but nevertheless disgrace. I mean, your career was over. So they had to be very discreet, and they became gifted at subterfuge. So yeah, working for the NKVD, I don't think he had very useful secrets, but also talent spotting for undergraduates. Kim Philby was a bit younger than, born 1912. So was Guy Burgess, others, Donald Maclean, John Cairncross, all at Cambridge, mostly at Trinity. And Cairncross and Maclean, both linguists, of course. And then in the Second World War, he was helping the Soviets a little bit. But he became an art historian, working as the Courtauld in the late 1930s, sorry. It was in 1937, he spent some time with his widowed mother here at Pond House. And the pond is just yonder. You can see the weeping willow standing over it, the far side of that white van. Right at the end of the Second World War, he was a viewer of the King's pictures, as in the official historian of the royal family. He was sent to Germany right after the Second World War to a certain German castle to retrieve some documents. And no one's quite sure what these documents were, what was so compromising. There is conjecture, it's speculated that this was correspondence between the erstwhile king, King Edward VIII, then Duke of Windsor, so that the Quondam King had been made Governor General of the Bahamas for the duration of the Second World War. He felt he was more or less exiled to what he regarded as a third-rate colony, and he was thought to be openly sympathetic to National Socialism, but we're not quite sure. So he cut off all contact with the Soviets by this time, but just after the Second World War, someone saw Blunt walking down the corridor in Buckingham Palace, and one man supposedly whispers to the other, "That's Anthony Blunt, he's a Russian spy." I think he had been, so he'd been more or less openly known about. But of course, the Soviet Union being a vital ally in the Second World War, that was not seen to be too much of a disadvantage. This was sort of an undergraduate idiosyncrasy that more than a few of them went through, this infantile disease that you soon grew out of. And the establishment would deprive itself of many gifted men's talents if it had a complete bar on former communists serving them. So that was it really. It's in 1951, obviously, Kim Philby and Guy Burgess, they fled to Moscow via I think it was Prague. In the mid-1960s, Blunt was unmasked. It was realised that he had been a communist agent. He gave a completely frank confession in return for immunity for prosecution. And that deal stood. I think it was about 1962 when, sorry, not Philby, it was Burgess and McLean fled in 50-51. It was Philby fled from Beirut when he realised it was about to be rumbled. It's quite possible that he was tipped off by MI6 because they didn't want the embarrassment of a public trial and it all coming out in the wash and really undermining American faith in the British again, saying the British were complete klutzes not to have done their homework. They should have realised that Philby had been a communist since about 1932 when he went to Vienna, married Litzy Friedman, a well-known communist, and all the rest of it. Even the mayor of Jerusalem, Eddie Kolek, who was a Viennese, had known that. He said it very openly. But anyway, so by the mid-60s, the establishment were on to Blunt, and he was allowed to keep his post at the Courtauld. There's a Courtauld Institute of Art. I think it's not teaching fine art, as in painting and drawing. I think it's more about the history of art. It's in central London, housed at Somerset House these days. So, and then he stayed on there, teaching some very distinguished academics of the next generation down. I can't remember that famous one who's presented all those teleprograms. But it's 1979, Thatcher became Prime Minister, but she decided there was no reason why this immunity deal should stand, and so she announced in Parliament that Blunt had been a traitor. So there were howls of outrage, and people said he should be sacked from this and that, and he went into hiding briefly. Some of his former pupils helped to hide him. He gave an interview saying, yes, he realised what had been a terrible mistake. He'd done something really wrong. He had served an absolutely filthy and bloodthirsty regime. But when he realised he'd done something so barbaric, then obviously he never did it again. But in the 1930s, it really seen the really two sides, communists and Nazis. The Nazis seemed really perilous to civilization because that was a sort of existential threat to civilization. Therefore, it was his bounden duty to save the only power mighty enough to defeat the Third Reich. Anyway, so he was able to gradually come out of hiding and rebuild his life. He died in 1983, and he was cremated at Golders Green, and his ashes were scattered in the hills overlooking Marlborough, where he'd been a teenager. So I'm reading Miranda Carter's magisterial and riveting biography of Anthony Blunt. So that's enough from me. Toodle pip.